A small flame appears in a place that was never meant to be bright. It slides along a sealed corridor like a cautious thought, and the stone seems to lean in, listening. Dust lifts and swirls, slow as sleep. In that narrow glow, the famous Egypt of postcards, the gold, the blue, the perfect profile of a king stands at the edge of vision, while a darker Egypt waits just outside the light, patient and unadvertised. Egypt was built to be remembered. It carved triumphs into cliffs and stacked temples toward the sun, as if the sky itself should keep score. Walls declared order, harmony, abundance. It also recorded love poems, tax lists, and grocery complaints, with the same steady care who received beer, who owed grain, who argued over a donkey. The official voice was confident, polished, eternal. Yet when the story turns toward punishment, toward confinement, toward the cost of disobedience, the record softens. Details blur. Words that should burn are reduced to quiet notes. The contrast feels chosen. A civilization obsessed with eternity treated its harshest justice as something meant to pass, not something meant to last. And still, the evidence exists. Not where tourists aim their cameras, but in fragile survivors' papyrus sheets browned like dried leaves, ink that has outlived the hands that shaped it. A worker's journal might complain about stale bread and, a line later, mention a beating the way someone might mention rain. A court text might list witnesses, goods, and names, and then glide past the moment of harm as if the scribe did not want to look up. There are decrees in careful language, receipts for missing tools, notes about grain that vanished, and occasional lines about people held under guard. It is a paper trail that seems too delicate to carry terror, and yet it does. The first clue is what Egypt chose to shout. When the state wanted to frighten the future, it made threats permanent. Tomb walls warned thieves with the voice of gods. Temple entrances promised ruin to anyone who disturbed sacred property. The language is loud and cosmic, as if the universe will personally punish the trespasser. But when punishment actually happened, when wrists were tied, when bodies were struck, when someone vanished into a guarded room and returned, changed, the record often turns careful and brief. The threats are chiseled into stone. The real consequences are written in ink that can fade. That is where the listening begins. Historians do not only read what is written, they read what is missing. A torn edge can remove a name the way a knife removes a label. A smudge can hide an outcome. A phrase repeated across different documents can suggest a formula, and a formula suggests someone wanted events to sound routine, manageable, harmless. Even a clean copy can feel suspicious. If a text is too neat, too tidy, it may be the second version, an edited memory that keeps the order and trims the mess. Some silences the record keeps on purpose, like a locked door. So the lantern moves forward, slower now, not hunting spectacle but tracing patterns. What kinds of wrongdoing were written plainly, and what kinds were wrapped in polite vagueness? Who is named, and who becomes only the accused? When a line mentions confinement, does it mean a cell, a storeroom, a temple compound, or a work site held together by guards and ration bowls? The more fragments are gathered, the more the quiet begins to form a picture. A system that could be orderly and still cruel, practical and still terrifying, all while presenting itself as calm. This is the promise of the descent. Not a list of cruelties for shock, but a map drawn from whispers, smears, and stubborn little lines that survived against all odds. The story will follow those lines into the hidden rooms behind Egypt's bright facade, where order was enforced when no one wanted the details remembered. And once the silence has a shape, a sharper question rises, steady as a heartbeat. What did justice mean to people who believed the universe itself depended on balance? To understand Egyptian justice, the lantern must rise from corridors and papyrus and hover over something larger than any courthouse. In Egypt, law was not merely a set of rules that kept neighbors from stealing each other's goats. It was maintenance work on the universe, as practical and as holy as keeping a canal from silting shut. They had a name for the balance they believed held everything together: Ma'at, a small word carrying a heavy world truth, rightness, steadiness, the straight line a boat follows when the river is calm. Sometimes it was pictured as a feather, light enough to drift, yet heavy enough to judge a heart. When Egyptians spoke of Ma'at, they were not talking about private opinions. They meant the pattern that made mornings arrive, the reason grain grew, the invisible agreement that the sun would climb back into the sky. If that pattern was real, then it could be protected, repaired, defended. Kings claimed that role with a confidence that still echoes off temple walls. They did not say they merely obeyed Ma'at. They said they made it, the way others might claim they built a bridge or raised a wall. The message sounded comforting. The ruler keeps the world steady. The Nile rises, the fields drink, the gods are honored, the people live. In that story, law becomes harmony, and punishment becomes an unpleasant tool used only when necessary, like cutting away rot so a tree survives. This is why the surviving records can feel strangely gentle even when they are not. A civilization that introduced itself as a maker of balance could not easily celebrate the moments when balance was restored with a stick. Cruelty did not fit the official portrait. Violence was not the headline, it was the fine print. When a scribe noted a beating or a confinement as if mentioning a minor repair, it may have been more than habit. It may have been loyalty to the idea that order is beautiful, even when the methods were ugly. And yet, the idea has teeth. If Ma'at is the glue of reality, then wrongdoing is not just a personal failure, it is a crack. A small theft can become a widening fracture. A lie can become a loose stone in the foundation. The unsettling thought follows on its own. If the world depends on right order, then a threat to order can be treated like a threat to existence itself. In that frame, punishment stops looking like revenge and starts looking like emergency work. That is the quiet reveal Egypt rarely states outright. The system was not designed to be kind. It was designed to keep the world from tipping. The goal was restoration, not comfort. A person who broke rules could be seen as someone who disturbed a sacred arrangement, someone whose behavior invited chaos to seep in. Once a society believes that, the boundary between criminal and danger becomes thin enough to tear. It also explains why some people frightened authorities more than others. A hungry thief might be handled as a problem of property, but a disruptor, someone accused of undermining the king, defiling a temple, stirring unrest, or mocking the gods, could be treated as a living crack in the universe. How do you seal a crack that has a human face, a voice, a circle of friends? How do you stop fear from spreading if you believe fear itself can unbalance the world? The answer, for Egypt, was never only in lofty words. Ma'at had to be carried by hands by officials who listened, guards who watched, scribes who wrote, and neighbors who whispered. Once the cosmic job is understood, the story can descend again from the sky back to the street and follow those hands through doorways and alleys to learn how dread traveled through villages after dark and why some footsteps sounded louder than they should. With Ma'at hovering like an unseen ceiling, the story steps out of temples and into streets where order is not an idea but a daily chore. At dawn, when shutters stay closed and the river smells of wet reeds, men move with the calm authority of routine. Watchmen pace boundary paths, guards linger near granaries. A local official appears at a doorway with questions that sound friendly until they don't. Egypt does not depend on one police force, it depends on a web of duties and eyes. The first surprise is how intimate that web can be. Villages are tight knots of family, debt, favor, and old resentment. In planned worker settlements, houses stand shoulder to shoulder, and walls are thin enough for a whisper to travel. Everyone knows when rations are issued, when a quarrel spills into the lane, when a husband fails to return after sunset. Privacy is not a right so much as a brief accident, and the state can feel less like a distant king than a landlord with sacred backing. In that closeness, enforcement often begins before any guard lifts a hand. Neighbors watch neighbors, partly from care, partly from caution, partly because a watched life seems safer than an unseen one. A complaint starts as a rumor, hardens into a story, then drifts towards someone who has reason to listen. When a community learns that disorder brings trouble, it begins rehearsing order on itself. Then comes the scribe, and the air changes. The reed pen is light, but it can turn breath into record. A spoken accusation can be denied tomorrow. An inked line can outlive everyone involved. Names become fixed, amounts are counted, dates are pinned down. Writing turns messy life into a case, and a case can be carried from one office to another like a sealed jar. In a world that trusts lists, whoever holds the page can steer what truth will be taken for. Patrols existed, but enforcement lived in familiar roles: estate managers, temple clerks, foremen, and village councils. Authority was scattered through ordinary work, which made it hard to spot. The man who measured grain could decide who was short. The clerk who wrote the debt could turn it into a charge. That is why so many cases begin without bloodshed, not with a scream, but with a tally that refuses to balance. Grain that should be there is not. A tool vanishes from a yard. Temple property disappears like smoke. A labor obligation is missed, and the absence becomes evidence. Sometimes a crime does not need a witness. It only needs a shortage and a scribe with space on a page. When the numbers are wrong, someone must become the explanation. Once the complaint is written, it gains a strange momentum. The page travels faster than any person, from a household to an office, from an office to a higher desk. A name can be circled, copied, repeated, until it feels certain. The accused may not even know he has been chosen, not yet, by anyone alive. The unsettling part is how easily necessity becomes guilt. If rations shrink and mouths stay the same, what counts as stealing? If a man borrows a tool and returns it late, is it theft or survival? The system prefers clean categories. Life offers blurred edges. In that blur, fear grows, because anyone can be pulled into the story if the story needs a name. Arrest, when it comes, is plain. A guard arrives, an official speaks, and the accused walks away under watching eyes. The real mystery starts afterward. Egypt rarely built prisons as grand buildings. Confinement could be a guardhouse, a storeroom, a temple corner, or a work site under watch. So the lantern follows through the first doorway and asks, where do the accused go? And what does a prison look like when it hides in plain sight? The accused rarely met justice in a hall with banners and shouting. More often he met it in a room that smelled of ink, sweat, and grain, where the dangerous object was a flat board balanced on a scribe's knees. The scribe sat quietly, kindly, ready to turn a trembling story into lines that could not be taken back. Egypt's legal world rose in steps, like terraces along the river. At the bottom were local councils, elders, foremen, men who knew the faces, the grudges, the missing tools, the small thefts that could sour a whole neighborhood. Above them stood officials tied to estates, temples, and workshops, administrators who controlled rations and schedules, and who could decide whether a complaint was a nuisance or a warning flare. Higher still were courts linked to towns, with authority that reached beyond a single village, able to summon parties, inspect registers, and enforce penalties in the king's name. At the top, looming without always appearing, was the vizier, the king's chief administrator and the guardian of Ma'at. In formal words, he is painted as steady and fair, the hinge between divine order and human dispute. In practice, his presence could be felt even when his sandals were nowhere in sight, because everyone understood what the ladder meant. A case could climb, and climbing changed lives. Hearings did not need marble pillars. They happened where authority already lived, inside office rooms, near temple registers, at the edges of work compounds, in courtyards where petitioners waited with their problems like offerings. The setting was ordinary, which made it sharper. A man could be pulled from his routine and judged without the world pausing. The river still moved. Somewhere a child still laughed while someone else stood before men who could decide his food, his work, and his standing. The system could be surprisingly procedural. A complaint was recorded, names were listed, witnesses were called. Accounts were compared, not because the state loved truth, but because truth helped property return to its owner and labor return to its timetable. The scribe's pen moved as steadily as the Nile's current, and in that steadiness there was a strange comfort. Decisions were not always random. A person could plead, could argue, could bring supporters, could try to bend the story toward mercy, or at least toward a lesser wound. But formality is not the same thing as softness. A tidy system can be frightening precisely because it works. It does not need fury to injure. It needs procedure. It needs neat strokes that turn pain into an administrative step, then hands that carry out the step without hesitation. Calm handwriting can be a blade because it makes harm feel normal, and normal things are hardest to fight. And then there is the matter of who matters. Egypt was a ladder society, and justice leaned the way a ladder leans toward those who stood higher. The same accusation could land differently depending on the weight of a name. A noble scandal might be smoothed into silence, corrected with payment, framed as misunderstanding. A temple official might be shifted aside rather than publicly broken, because disgrace stains institutions as well as individuals. A laborer with no patrons could be treated as replaceable, and replacement is a brutal kind of sentence. Even the language of Ma'at could hide power. Courts spoke of balance, restoration, setting things straight. Yet outcomes often protected the structures that fed the state. Granaries, temples, workshops, the dignity of administrators, the image of kingship. Order was the banner. Control was the rope beneath it. This is the house of order, and also the house of fear. It looks organized from the outside, almost reassuring, until one notices how quickly a life can be reduced to a few lines of ink. Once a complaint enters the system, it does not simply drift away. It is held, weighed, copied, and moved upward if needed, until the accused becomes less a person than a problem to be solved. And the first tool of solving is often not a verdict, but waiting time used as pressure, while the accused is kept close, out of sight, behind a door that opens only when someone else decides. Detention in Egypt rarely announced itself with iron bars or dramatic locks. It arrived quietly, like a shadow sliding under a door. One day a man stood in the line for rations. The next his name sat on a list, and the doorway that had always opened simply did not. A cell isn't always stone. Sometimes it is the moment your name is copied, and the world keeps moving without you. Outside, the river kept its schedule, and inside, a single reed pen scratch could redraw a life overnight quietly. The places of waiting were ordinary rooms made strange by custody. A watch post near a gatehouse, a storeroom behind an estate office, a side chamber in a temple compound where deliveries were counted, a work camp at the edge of a quarry. They were built to manage grain, tools, and labor, and a person could become one more item to be managed. Confinement could be as simple as turning someone away from the street and placing him within reach of a guard's bored stare, where even daylight felt borrowed. The first punishment was uncertainty. No one told you when the hearing would happen, or whether a superior had already chosen the outcome and merely needed signatures. You waited for footsteps, a guard's glance, a messenger who never came. You wondered whether family would be allowed close enough to pass bread, or whether fear would keep them away. Hunger made time thicker. Silence made it heavier. Even innocent thoughts could begin to sound like confessions when they echoed inside your skull. Then comes the quiet twist. Waiting was useful to the state. Detention was not always a sentence handed down after judgment. Often it was the tool that shaped judgment. Keep someone close, and missing property might reappear. Hold a suspect long enough, and the names of others might be offered, true or invented, just to make the door open again. Leave a man in shadow and blame might settle where officials preferred it. Leverage did not need spectacle, it needed patience, and a door that stayed shut until the story suited someone. Because in these holding spaces, food was not guaranteed, water was a favor, a mat was kindness, not policy. The body learned quickly what power felt like. Not a whip in the air, but a portion controlled by another hand. A guard could delay a message, forget a visitor, or lose a petition. If detention lasted days, the world beyond the wall became a rumor. If it lasted longer, a person's old life began to loosen, thread by thread, work, reputation, friendships, the simple confidence of being ordinary. Modern minds like clean categories: prisoner, debtor, captive, worker. Egypt often blurred them. A man awaiting questioning might share a guarded room with someone bound by debt, or with an outsider taken in war and assigned to labor. Another might be a worker punished for deserting a project. In the eyes of administration, the the labels mattered less than the outcome. Controlled movement, controlled work, controlled names, controlled breath. When people are filed under risk, the same key can turn for all of them. Listen closely, and the soundscape is not dramatic. It is lists being read, reed pens scratching, keys shifting on a belt, sandals scraping stone, a guard yawning because the night is long and the detainee is not a story, just a duty. Grand monuments promise eternity, but detention shrinks life to a corner of shade, to a patch of floor, to the distance between one heartbeat and the next, while the lamp burns down and the hours pretend to be nothing. Yet detention is only the start of the system's message. Once the waiting ends, once testimony is weighed and a decision is spoken, the question sharpens. When Egypt chose to punish, what did it do to a body, and what lesson did that body carry back into the light? When the verdict finally arrives, it rarely arrives with poetry. Egyptian records speak as if the harshest moments should stay off the page, tucked behind polite phrases and tidy sums. A scribe will note what was taken, what must be returned, who testified, who swore an oath, then step lightly around the consequence, as though ink itself would rather not stare. That restraint is a clue. The punishments were not always described, but the outcomes were arranged so that anyone nearby could understand what had happened. Even the quietest penalty left a shadow in daylight. Penalty in Egypt stretched along a spectrum. At one end were clean solutions that could be counted: repayment, fines, restitution measured in grain, copper, cloth, or extra days of service owed back to a temple, an estate, or a workshop storehouse. These endings can sound almost gentle, and sometimes they were, especially when officials wanted property restored more than bodies broken. Yet even a mild decision could empty a home. A demanded payment might mean jars left dry, tools sold, and children eating less so an adult could satisfy the tally and keep a place at the ration line. Move farther along the spectrum, and the language grows sharper. Physical punishment was useful because it was quick, visible, and economical. A beating does not require months of housing. It requires a moment, witnesses, and someone authorized to swing. It teaches without speeches. The lesson is written on skin in a script anyone can read. Because it is seen, it multiplies. One person suffers, many people learn, and fear does the traveling for free, slipping through lanes and markets like evening air. Here, the contrast becomes unavoidable. Egypt spoke of harmony, yet much of its discipline protected resources more than ideals. Theft was dangerous because it threatened grain stores that fed workers and kept projects alive. Corruption was feared because it drained temple wealth. And temples were not only holy, they were engines of land, food, and influence. Desertion mattered because state work could not pause without consequence. A missing worker could slow a quarry, delay a canal, or leave a royal tomb unfinished, a promise to the dead hanging open like a door. That grim practicality explains the pattern. Certain offences drew routine blows, penalties so common they barely earned explanation in surviving texts. Other acts, especially those judged stubborn or contagious, invited escalation, marking the body so the warning would not fade. Cutting, disfigurement, branding, and other lasting signs appear at the edge of the record like shadows crossing a wall. Officials did not always preserve the method, yet they wanted the result to linger in a face, in a limp, in the way other people stepped aside before a marked person even spoke. Then there are crimes that touch the sacred and the political, the ones that struck too close to the king's story of stability. Violations of tombs, attacks on holy property, threats against royal authority, these were not treated as simple misbehavior, they were treated as ruptures. For such taboos, death could serve not only to remove but to announce. The harshest message did not need many words. It needed a decision that could not be undone, and a community that would whisper about it long after the dust had settled and the officials had gone home. The chill, once felt, is hard to shake. Egypt's justice was not random. It was aimed. It chose penalties the way an archer chooses distance and wind, measuring where dread would travel farthest and land deepest. A powerful name might bend an outcome. A powerless body might become the display, and once that aim is understood, the next turn becomes inevitable. When the state wanted more than a moment of pain, when it wanted years repaid, hands controlled, energy harvested, it sent people into labor worlds built to extract value, where punishment became stone, sweat, and silence. Night in a worker village does not drop like a curtain, it settles like fine dust. An oil lamp shivers in a doorway, turning faces into soft masks and making every shadow seem awake. Behind thin walls, families shift on mats and speak in low voices about rations, aching backs, and the small humiliations that come with living close to other people's hunger. Somewhere a dog barks, then stops, as if it remembers who owns the night. One set of footsteps crosses the lane, not running, not hiding, just steady and certain. In places like this, sound is a kind of gossip. A cough is noticed, a late return is counted. When a settlement is planned and the work is royal, privacy becomes a luxury nobody can truly afford. In communities such as Deir el-Medina, where craftsmen carved tombs for kings, the men shaped eternity while their own lives were measured by lists, attendance, and distribution bowls. The irony is quiet. Those who built hidden chambers were themselves easy to count, easy to watch. Crime here is not exotic. It is familiar, almost domestic. A chisel missing from a workyard, bread that vanishes before morning, a tool borrowed and never returned, an argument over a boundary stone, a remark spoken too loudly after beer. These are the beginnings, small enough to shrug at until they aren't. In a world held together by accounting, the smallest shortage demands an explanation. Something must balance, or someone must. Rumors do most of the traveling. They slip between houses the way smoke slips through reeds. A neighbor notices that another family's jar looks too full this week. A foreman counts bundles and feels the numbers tilt. A child repeats a sentence without understanding it, and the sentence grows teeth as it passes from mouth to mouth. By the time an official arrives, the story is already shaped, warmed by suspicion, and polished by repetition. The unsettling twist is where many cases begin, not in the street, but inside the home. Inheritance disputes turn siblings into rivals. Jealousy makes a marriage feel like a trial before anyone has written a word. Debt becomes a chain wrapped in polite language. A quarrel over grain reopens old wounds, and once a wound is open, someone will press on it. When accusations rise from a household, they carry an intimacy that makes them sound true even when they are cruel. Here, a reed pen becomes a lever. A person with status, or simply a person with access to a scribe, can turn private conflict into public danger. Once a complaint is written, it gains weight. It can be read aloud, copied, carried upward. The accused is forced to answer not only to family, but to the village, and then to the machinery beyond the village. Suddenly the stakes are larger than pride. Reputation decides who gets hired, who receives favors, who is believed when the next shortage appears. Witnesses become currency. Truth is not always what happened, it is what can be supported. Who saw the tool last? Who can swear the bread was there at dusk? Who is willing to risk anger by speaking? Some people trade testimony for protection. Others stay silent because silence is safer than accuracy. A man may be innocent and still find himself alone, because loneliness is one more method of control. The community learns, without being taught, that survival can mean choosing the right side early. This is how the state thrives without constant spectacle. It borrows the village's eyes and the household's grudges. It lets neighbors do the first policing, then arrives with paperwork to make the policing official. Order grows best when people enforce it on each other, because that kind of order is cheap, and it feels natural, and it can be called common sense. By the time the accused is summoned, the village has already rehearsed the verdict in whispers. Then the knock returns, but now it is the knock of procedure. A name is called, a question is repeated. And the story moves from rumor into interrogation, where calm voices can still corner a person until even his own memory begins to feel uncertain. For the moment, interrogation begins the way fog begins, softly, almost politely, until a person realizes the world has narrowed. An official asks for a name, then asks again. A scribe sits nearby, calm as carved stone, and every answer becomes a line that can outlive the speaker. In Egypt, the word confession is slippery. It can mean truth, surrender, exhaustion, or the simple desire to make the questions stop. The search for certainty had rituals. Witnesses were brought in and asked to repeat what they saw, or what they believed they saw. Oaths were taken with the weight of gods behind them, because a lie was not only a social risk, it was a crack in order. Questions returned in circles. Where were you? Who was with you? What did you touch? What did you take? What did you hear? The repetition was the point. It tested a story the way hands test a jar for hidden fractures, pressing until something gives. Sometimes what gave was the person. Surviving records, when they speak plainly, mention beating with chilling casualness, as if pain were an ordinary tool on an administrator's shelf. The mind flinches toward the blow, but the more haunting moment is the pause before it, when a room decides that words are no longer enough. A system that praises harmony can still reach for force when harmony does not arrive on schedule. Here is the moral trap that closes like a door. Confessions were treasured because they made the page feel complete. A confession ties a bow on uncertainty. It restores balance in writing, which means it restores authority in public. But when words are pulled from hunger, fear, or bruised resolve, they can manufacture clarity that never existed. The story becomes neat, and neat stories are seductive, especially to officials who must report results and keep their own positions safe. For the accused, time becomes a weapon. Hours without food turn thoughts slow and sticky. Sleeplessness blurs edges until even honest memory feels unreliable. Fear of a harsher punishment hovers like a bird that never lands, and the mind begins to bargain with itself. Say something smaller. Admit to something safer. Offer a name. Offer two. If the system needs an ending, it will accept an ending. That is how investigations widen. Ink spreads in water, and suspicion spreads the same way, quietly, then suddenly everywhere. One man names another, perhaps truthfully, perhaps not, and the circle expands to cousins, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who once borrowed a tool or shared a drink. Each new suspect creates new questions, and each question demands a reply that fits the growing shape of the case. Eventually someone fits the crime the way a stone fits a gap, not because it belongs there, but because the wall demands a plug and officials need the draft to stop. The atmosphere is often more frightening than the violence. There are no theatrical speeches, only administrative patience. Sandals scrape the floor. A reed pen scratches. A clerk clears his throat. The same question returns, unchanged, as if the words themselves are indifferent to human trembling. Even the smell of oil lamps and old papyrus seems to insist on order. In that steady rhythm, convenience can walk beside truth without being noticed, and the line between procedure and coercion can fade until it disappears, leaving only the impression that the paper is satisfied and the room can breathe again. When the questioning ends, the body does not simply go home. A name has been written, a story has been fixed. Often the accused learns the charge after days of silence. The officials can now read that story aloud, stack it with other files, and call the matter understood. And before any final judgment is spoken, many suspects are already guided into holding places, guardhouses, storerooms, temple corners, where confinement begins to feel like punishment, long before a verdict makes it official. When we imagine imprisonment, we picture walls first. Stone barriers, iron doors, places designed for nothing except holding human bodies in place. Ancient Egypt rarely worked that way. Confinement there was fluid, portable, and unsettlingly ordinary. It slipped into spaces already meant for living, storing, worshipping, and working. The prison was not always a destination. Often, it was simply where you already were, once someone decided you were no longer free. Across Egypt, guarded compounds existed, but they were fewer than modern minds expect. Temple precincts enclosed by walls could quietly become holding zones. Quarry camps on the desert edge doubled as places of punishment. Administrative buildings, built to tally grain or manage labor, could suddenly absorb the accused, the indebted, or the disobedient. Rather than constructing massive permanent prisons everywhere, authorities leaned on what already stood. Control did not require architecture alone. It required presence, routine, and dependence. In many cases, confinement traveled with the work itself. A workforce sent to dig stone or dredge canals did not leave captivity behind at the gate. Guards accompanied them. Rations followed a schedule. Movement was allowed only within narrow boundaries. If you slept, labored, ate, and waited under supervision, your location mattered less than your condition. You were contained by function, not by walls. This reveals a quieter truth. In Egypt, freedom often dissolved not through chains, but through supply. Food came from officials. Water breaks were regulated. Tools were issued and reclaimed. If the next meal depended on obedience, escape became theoretical. You could walk, but know where that fed you. You could refuse, but only briefly. Hunger enforced order more efficiently than locks ever could. The people caught in this system occupied unstable categories. A man accused of theft might work beside a debtor. A foreign captive could share rations with a local laborer under discipline. These labels slid into each other, sometimes within the same season. Punishment did not always announce itself with ceremony. It crept in through reassignment, supervision, and reduced status. One day you were a worker. The next, you were a worker who could not leave. This liminal state confuses modern expectations. We want clear lines between prisoner and citizen, sentence and job, justice and economy. Egypt blurred them deliberately. Work camps were not separate from society. They were society, reorganized under pressure. To be detained was often to be repurposed. The system asked not whether someone should suffer, but whether their effort could still be extracted. Even temples, places we associate with sanctity, participated in this logic. Temple estates controlled vast resources and labor forces. To be confined within their walls could feel holy in name and restrictive in practice. Sacred space did not guarantee freedom. It often meant stricter oversight, written records, and watchful eyes that never slept. This structure forces a rethink. If imprisonment is defined by loss of autonomy rather than location, then Egypt's prisons were everywhere. They appeared wherever authority controlled time, food, and motion. The absence of massive jail complexes was not a lack of punishment. It was a different strategy altogether. This arrangement also protected the image of order. By hiding punishment inside daily administration, the state avoided spectacle while maintaining control. There were fewer dramatic cells to point to, fewer symbols of cruelty to remember. Instead, discipline blended into routine. To an outsider, a worksite looked productive, even noble. Only those inside understood how narrow the margins were, how carefully every step, pause, and breath was measured by someone else. Silence made the system feel natural, inevitable, and invisible. Once this becomes clear, another pattern emerges. The most common sentence was not isolation nor execution, but labor. Work absorbed the condemned, the accused, and the inconvenient. Justice demanded output. Punishment built roads, temples, and monuments. With confinement redefined, the story now follows the condemned into labor itself, where suffering quietly became infrastructure and pain was converted into permanence. Ancient Egypt did not always need chains to keep people in place. Sometimes it used geography. Towns thinned into riverbanks dissolved into desert, and the land itself took over the work of confinement. This was carceral geography, though no one at the time would have named it so. Distance became discipline. Remoteness became restraint. The farther one was sent from familiar streets and shared voices, the harder it became to imagine leaving at all. From settled towns along the Nile, the narration moves outward. Fields give way to rock. Shade disappears. The river narrows into memory. Work sites appear where nothing else reasonably should exist. Quarries carved into cliffs, mining camps pressed against barren hills, canal projects stretching into heat-hazed distance. These places were productive, but they were also containing. Escape routes were few. Sympathetic witnesses were fewer. The horizon looked open, yet offered no shelter, no food, no water beyond what was rationed. In such landscapes, nature became an extra guard. Wind erased footprints, Stone punished the careless. Thirst enforced obedience more effectively than threats. Even without walls, the desert circled inward, pressing the body into compliance. One could walk away, in theory, but only toward emptiness. The land did not chase you. It simply waited. This is where a quiet realization settles in. Some of Egypt's greatest projects rose from these places. Stone hauled from distant quarries, gold extracted from hostile ground, roads and canals cut through terrain that resisted every blow. Not everyone who labored there arrived willingly. Some were sentenced workers, some were bound by debt, some were captives redirected into state demands. The documentary resists the temptation to flatten these lives into a single story. Variety mattered. There were paid specialists who knew their craft and negotiated their value. There were others whose presence was compulsory, whose choice ended when the assignment began. What unified them was outcome, not origin. Forced productivity blurred distinctions. Once at the site, the schedule ruled everyone equally. Dawn signaled labor. Rations marked time. Supervision closed the circle. Whether skilled or condemned, the body became part of a system designed to extract effort until the season ended. The task was complete, or the worker failed. Distance amplified this power. Far from home, the usual ties dissolved. Family could not intervene. Local officials held less sway. Appeals, if they existed at all, traveled slowly across heat and bureaucracy. Isolation did not need bars. It needed silence. The desert provided that in abundance. The narration lingers here, letting the environment speak. Wind slides over stone. Sunlight flattens color. The scale feels overwhelming, beautiful, and cruel at once. This is where awe mixes with dread. National ambition demanded resources, and resources demanded labor. Punishment and policy met in the same place, indistinguishable once the work began. History's monuments carry this tension quietly, their surfaces smooth enough to hide the cost beneath. Importantly, the system did not require everyone to be unfree. It only required enough people to be replaceable. When one body failed, another could be sent. Geography absorbed the loss. The land remembered nothing. From the state's view, the project advanced. From the workers' view, time stretched thin, measured not in days, but in endurance. In the desert, walls were unnecessary. The edge of water marked the limit of mercy. Beyond it, the landscape itself enforced confinement, stretching invisible barriers all the way to the horizon. Yet geography alone was not enough. Someone still had to count, assign, and ration. Landscapes could contain, but institutions had to administer. Within this system, punishment felt impersonal, almost accidental, as if one had simply wandered too far from safety. Orders arrived as assignments, not sentences. Compliance looked like work ethic. Resistance looked like inefficiency. This ambiguity protected those in charge, because coercion hid behind necessity. Stone needed cutting, gold needed lifting, canals needed clearing. The landscape demanded bodies, and the administration supplied them, rarely pausing to separate justice from convenience. In this way, geography and governance fused, making punishment feel like the natural order of things. From a distance, temples seem like places of refuge. Stone columns rise calmly against the sky. Reliefs promise order, balance, protection. Yet step closer, and another function comes into view. Temples in ancient Egypt were not only spiritual centers, they were economic engines, administrators of land, labor, and food. Where resources gather, power follows, and where power settles, control quietly takes root. A temple estate could rival a small town. It owned fields, workshops, boats, animals, and granaries. Priests were not only ritual specialists, but managers, record keepers, and overseers. Scribes tracked deliveries, guards watched gates, storerooms filled and emptied on schedule. In this environment, discipline was not an intrusion. It was part of daily operation. Maintaining order among workers, dependents, and visitors was framed as maintaining cosmic balance itself. This is where the overlap grows uncomfortable. Theft from a temple was not merely stealing grain or tools, it was an offense against the gods who owned that property. Punishment therefore carried extra weight. To be accused was to be marked not only as dishonest, but as impure. The temperature of justice rose quickly. Interrogation, detention, and forced labor could be justified as acts of restoration rather than cruelty. The same space that promised divine protection could also hold the accused in its back rooms. A worker suspected of wrongdoing might be kept within temple walls while records were checked and testimonies weighed. These were not dungeons in the dramatic sense. They were rooms repurposed, schedules adjusted, movement restricted. Confinement blended into administration so smoothly that it barely announced itself. To modernize, this feels contradictory. How could sacred ground also be a place of punishment? In Egyptian terms, it was not hypocrisy. It was coherence. The goal was ma'at, the principle of balance and rightness. If someone disrupted that balance, correcting them through labor, restriction, or public marking could be framed as sacred work. Justice did not oppose holiness, it served it. Control of food made this power tangible. Temples distributed rations to large populations of workers and dependents. To receive grain was to be recognized. To be cut off was to be erased. When an institution decides who eats and when, bodies follow rules quickly. Hunger does not debate theology, it obeys. Ritual added another layer. Temples controlled reputation through ceremony. A person could be excluded from rites, denied purification, or labeled as having offended the gods. These judgments traveled socially. To be known as wrong before the divine was to carry a stain that work alone might not remove. The temple did not need to shout. Its silence could be enough. Seen this way, the temple becomes a character with two faces. Out front, incense, chants, and promise. Behind the scenes, ledgers, schedules, guards, and quiet consequences. Serenity on the surface, pressure underneath. The beauty was real, so was the control. One did not cancel the other. This reframing unsettles romantic ideas of ancient spirituality. Yet, it remains fair. Temples did provide stability, food, and meaning. They also enforced norms with efficiency. Power wrapped in holiness tends to feel inevitable, even benevolent, until one stands on the wrong side of it. When the god's house also kept the keys, confinement could feel not like punishment, but like fate. As institutional power tightens, the abstract becomes practical. Ideals turn into procedures. Balance turns into enforcement. To understand how this felt day to day, the story now moves closer, into the routines that made control ordinary. Guards, restraints, and the small habits that taught people when not to move. The first thing a prison takes is rarely a body. It takes a name. In Egypt, custody often began not with walls, but with a mark in a record. Someone was written down as the accused, the debtor, the one under watch. In a world where most lives survive only as fragments, that label could eclipse everything else a person had been. The surviving texts do not linger on architecture. They speak instead of habits. Guards, assigned by shift, messengers delivering rations, scribes noting arrivals, absences, delays. Custody revealed itself through routine. Someone watched while another slept. Someone counted while another waited. Chains may appear briefly in records, but restraint was usually quieter. Limited movement, constant visibility, permission required for the smallest acts. Rations mattered more than bars. Food arrived at set times, measured and recorded. A missed portion was not dramatic, just devastating. Hunger softened resistance. It blurred hours. It made obedience feel practical rather than forced. Water, bread, beer, all passed through hands that belonged to the institution. The body learned quickly where its survival came from. Guards rotated. That detail appears often, almost casually. One man replaced another. Authority stayed while faces changed. This prevented familiarity. Indifference was preserved by design. A guard who did not know your story was less likely to hear it. Watching became a task, not a relationship. Control remained steady, impersonal, and difficult to challenge. Identity eroded slowly. Once named as accused, a person's previous roles weakened. Worker, neighbor, relative, all slipped behind the new title. In records, that label might be the only thing that remained. To be remembered as the accused was a kind of social death, even before any judgment was passed. The future narrowed to procedure. Families felt this erosion too. Access had to be negotiated. Food could be sent only with permission. Messages traveled through layers of oversight. Some families pushed back, appealing to officials or offering guarantees. Others stepped away, fearing association. Silence could be protective. Distance became a survival strategy for those outside. Communities adjusted quickly. Work still needed doing. Employers replaced missing hands. Fields were planted. Boats departed. Life did not pause for absence. This normalcy deepened the isolation. Confinement did not always remove someone from society. It left them standing near it, watching it continue without them. The suffering described here is quiet. No spectacle is required. A delayed hearing stretches into weeks. A guard shrugs. A name is written once and never amended. These small details accumulate, pressing inward. The tone remains calm because the system was calm. It did not rage, it processed. What emerges is confinement as social exile. A person could still breathe familiar air, hear familiar voices, and yet be unreachable. Presence without participation. Visibility without recognition. This was custody's deeper work, separating someone from their place while leaving them physically intact. Understanding this texture matters because it reframes what comes next. Punishment was not only about pain, it was about communication. Each penalty spoke a language the body understood and the community observed. With custody now clear in its routines and erasures, the story turns to consequence itself, to the methods chosen not for gore, but for the lessons they were meant to teach. They didn't always lock people away. More often, they put them to work until the work itself closed around them. In Egypt, labor was not just how the state functioned, it was how the state disciplined. When time, muscle, and endurance formed the backbone of national ambition, punishment naturally took the same shape. Imagine following a condemned person into a work assignment. There is no dramatic announcement, no moment where freedom visibly ends. There is an order, a destination, a task. Stone must be cut. Loads must be hauled. Earth must be moved so water will flow where officials decide it should. The sentence is written not in years, but in effort. Each sunrise begins the same way, and each sunset leaves the body slightly less its own. This was efficient justice. Instead of isolating offenders, the system absorbed them. A punished body could still produce value. Roads expanded, quarries fed temples, canals strengthened harvests. The state did not waste labor when it could redirect it. In doing so, punishment became infrastructure, and suffering left behind tangible results that outlived the worker. The key question emerges quietly. When work sustains the entire system, how else could punishment look? Egypt did not need elaborate cells to make an example. A laboring body under supervision sent a clear message. Disobedience did not remove you from society. It placed you at its hardest edge, where effort was constant and mercy scarce. The documentary is careful here, because not all monumental labor was punishment. Many workers were paid specialists, skilled artisans, seasonal crews fulfilling state service obligations. Corvée labor, a form of required public work, touched large portions of the population at different times. Penal labor existed alongside these systems, sometimes visibly, sometimes indistinguishably. That overlap is part of the unease. For the poor and powerless, the boundary between sentence and assignment could blur. A missed payment, an accusation, or a debt might funnel someone into work that looked similar to conscription but felt very different. Choice evaporated, duration stretched, supervision tightened. What mattered was not the category, but the loss of control. The sensory world of this punishment was relentless. Heat pressed down without pause. The rhythm of tools set the pace of breath. Overseers watched, counted, corrected. Rest was timed. Food was earned. Shame lingered in being observed constantly, in knowing that others could see you laboring not as a worker, but as an example. The body learned its place through repetition. This kind of sentence punished slowly. It wore people down without spectacle. There were no crowds, no rituals of pain meant for sudden terror. Instead, there was endurance. Day after day, the same motion, the same oversight, the same awareness that escape led only to thirst or worse. The land itself reinforced the lesson. Importantly, the system did not frame this as cruelty. It framed it as use. A body that could work should work. Idleness was disorder. Productivity was restoration. In that logic, penal labor was almost moral. The condemned repaid imbalance with effort. Justice did not discard bodies. It corrected them by exhausting them. By the end of this section, a core theme settles in. Egypt's justice rarely sought to remove people entirely. It sought to reshape their usefulness. Labor became both sentence and warning, a living sign that the state could say not only where you stood, but how your strength would be spent. Yet labor takes time to teach its lesson. Sometimes the state wanted obedience now, not after weeks of digging or hauling. When delay felt dangerous, different methods emerged, sharper and more immediate. From slow punishment, the story now turns toward faster discipline, where the body itself became the message. When a society treats pain like paperwork, something profound has already shifted. In ancient Egypt, beatings appear in records with unsettling calm. They are noted without flourish, without outrage, sometimes without explanation. A line records that someone was struck, and the document moves on. Pain, here, functions as punctuation, a mark inserted to keep the sentence of order moving forward. This was not accidental. Beatings were efficient. They were swift, required no long-term confinement, and could be administered almost anywhere. A courtyard, a work site, an administrative room could all become stages of correction. Authority did not need to build new structures to deliver pain. It only needed a body, a tool, and permission. The texts rarely dwell on sensation, and neither does this account. What matters is meaning. A beating was visible. It could be heard. It traveled socially. Bruises spoke without words. They reminded others what disobedience cost, especially those already low in status. Pain moved faster than rumor and lingered longer than a warning. For many offenses, this response was not exceptional. It was routine. Missed quotas, minor thefts, disrespect, delays, failures of obedience could all invite blows. Especially for laborers, servants, and the poor, the threshold was low. Higher status individuals often faced negotiation, fines, or reassignment instead. The pattern is uneven, and that unevenness is the point. Discipline followed power. Uncertainty shaped fear. Records do not always say how many strokes were delivered, or precisely why one person received 10 and another 20. Discretion lived in the hands of officials and overseers. This variability made punishment unpredictable. You could not calculate pain in advance. You could only avoid drawing attention. In this way, pain became part of the social contract. Obey, pay, work, or be struck back into line. The system did not need to explain itself repeatedly. The body learned. The memory of pain did administrative work long after the blows ended. What chills modern readers is the emotional temperature of it all. There is no fury in the records, no moral wrestling. The act is procedural. Authority remains calm while inflicting suffering. This is not chaos. It is order expressing itself through flesh. Beatings also scaled. One person could be struck, or many, in succession. The spectacle could be private or public, adjusted to the message required. The same method corrected an individual and warned a group. Pain was flexible, adaptable, and therefore powerful. It mattered who held authority. Overseers, scribes, and local officials interpreted rules through habit and bias. A familiar worker might be spared, a stranger might not. Gender, status, and usefulness all bent outcomes quietly. The beating was the same action, but its likelihood varied sharply. This selectivity reinforced hierarchy, teaching everyone where they stood without speeches or decrees. Silence did much of the work. Because pain left marks, it also left stories. Even when officials wrote little, communities filled the gaps. People noticed who limped, who missed days, who returned quieter. Fear traveled sideways, not just downward. Compliance spread not because everyone was struck, but because everyone could imagine it happening. The threat did not need repetition. This normality numbs. When punishment becomes expected, resistance feels abnormal. The system depended on that inversion. To protest pain was to challenge order itself. Most did not. They adjusted posture, pace, and tone instead. In that adjustment, authority settled deeper into everyday life. Yet even this tool had limits. Some people endured, some offences repeated, some defiance did not dissolve under blows. When paperwork failed to restore order, escalation followed. The system reached for penalties that did not fade with time, marks that altered bodies and identities permanently. From routine discipline, the story now rises into harsher territory, where punishment was designed not just to hurt, but to linger. These measures spoke loudly, ensuring memory outlasted pain, and the lesson followed the punished long after authority stopped watching within communities and across generations alike. A scar can be a memory, but in Egypt it could also be a sentence that never ended. Some punishments did not conclude with pain or labor. They stayed. They altered the body so that the judgment followed a person home, into every future interaction, long after officials stopped watching. Historical sources speak, sometimes obliquely, of penalties that removed or damaged parts of the body. Cutting off a nose, an ear, fingers, striking the face in ways meant to leave lasting marks. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate edits to a person's social existence. The body became a record, readable by anyone who knew what to look for. The power of these punishments lay not only in what they took away, but in what they announced. A disfigured face required no explanation. It spoke silently of wrongdoing, of judgment already passed. The individual no longer controlled the story of who they were. Their appearance told it first. This rewrote daily life. Work options narrowed sharply. Certain trades required trust, symmetry, or physical wholeness. A marked body could disqualify someone before they even spoke. Employers chose others. Opportunities closed without argument. Survival became harder in ways that felt ordinary, even polite. Marriage prospects shifted as well. Families weighed risk carefully. A visible mark suggested danger, shame, or divine displeasure. Even if the crime was long past, suspicion lingered. The punishment outlived its official purpose, shaping relationships that had nothing to do with the original offense. Community trust eroded quietly. Neighbors might still share space, but distance crept in. Eyes lingered, then looked away. Invitations slowed. The marked person became someone to be cautious around. This was justice that did not need enforcement. Society itself carried it forward. These penalties are difficult to track precisely. Records are sparse, uneven, sometimes silent. Egypt's official ideology prized harmony, balance, and order. Permanent bodily damage disrupted that image. A world governed by Ma'at was supposed to be whole. Disfigurement complicated the story the state preferred to tell about itself. And yet, the penalties existed. Their very presence suggests an understanding of symbolism that ran deep. A lasting mark taught lessons that words could not. It warned others without repetition. It conserved resources. One punishment educated many. The state did not need to revisit the case. The body did the work. There is also restraint here. These punishments were not everywhere, not constant. They were reserved, chosen. That selectivity mattered. When marking was used, it signaled that the offense struck at something foundational. Trust, property, sacred order. The rarity increased the weight. For the punished, The future became a negotiation. How to live when your body testified against you. How to rebuild identity when appearance fixed meaning. Some adapted, some vanished from records entirely. Absence itself may be part of the story, a quiet erasure that mirrors the punishment's intent. What emerges is a system that understood consequence as continuity. Pain fades, labor ends, marks remain. They turned time into an ally of authority. Every day after the hearing extended the sentence anew. Yet even this was sometimes judged insufficient. Certain crimes were believed to threaten more than order. Violations against gods, kings, or tombs struck at eternity itself. For these, leaving the body alive, even marked, risked letting danger persist. In those cases, the system reached for its final answer. Marking the body was one kind of message, powerful and enduring. But there was another, darker one, reserved for the highest stakes. To understand it, the story must move into territory where punishment did not just follow you through life, but aimed to end it, and perhaps erase what came after. In a land obsessed with eternal life, punishment could reach far beyond the moment of death. Execution in ancient Egypt carried a weight that feels unfamiliar today, because dying was not always the end of the story. How a person died, and what followed, mattered just as much as the final breath. The ultimate penalty was not only to kill the body, but to disturb the future that body was meant to have. For Egyptians, death was a transition, not a conclusion. Tombs were prepared carefully. Names were preserved in stone. Rituals ensured that identity continued, that memory remained anchored in the world. Against this backdrop, execution took on a deeper menace. Certain punishments threatened to interrupt the journey itself, severing the link between life and what came after. The records are cautious, sometimes fragmented, because practices changed across dynasties and regions. There was no single method, no uniform script. Yet a pattern emerges. The harshest penalties did not stop at physical death. They extended into what might be called the second punishment, the denial of burial rites, the destruction of names, the quiet dismantling of a person's afterlife. To be denied proper burial was not simply disrespect. It was catastrophic. Without rituals, the dead risked becoming restless, incomplete, or lost. The tomb was more than a resting place. It was a machine for eternity. To withhold it was to break that machine deliberately. Fear did the rest. Name destruction carried similar force. A name was not a label. It was a vital component of existence. To erase it from records, to chip it away from walls, was to attack continuity itself. Memory fed survival beyond death. Oblivion starved it. This is why erasure appears in sources as a deliberate act, not an afterthought. This introduces a chilling realization. Execution could target belief as much as flesh. The state understood that some threats travel farther than weapons. Guards eventually sleep, walls eventually crumble. But fear rooted in worldview follows people home, into dreams, into choices made when no one is watching. Importantly, not every execution was theatrical. Modern imagination leans towards spectacle, but Egyptian administration often favored efficiency. Some deaths were quiet, recorded briefly, then closed. No crowd, no performance. The coldness lies there, in the sense that a life could be ended as a matter of procedure and then erased as a matter of policy. This restraint increased the power of the threat. When punishment is rare and poorly defined, imagination fills the gaps. People knew what could happen, even if they never saw it. The possibility alone enforced obedience, because it operated internally. Fear became portable. The documentary moves carefully here, resisting exaggeration. There were executions, but they were not constant. They were reserved for crimes believed to endanger cosmic order itself, betrayal, sacrilege, violations against tombs, gods, or kings. These were not just legal offenses, they were existential ones. The punishment reflected that scale. Death, then, was not a single event. It was a chain of consequences. Body, name, memory, future. Each link could be broken. The more links severed, the stronger the message. Authority did not merely end lives. It shaped how those lives would be remembered or forgotten. What lingers is the psychological precision of it all. By threatening eternity, the state reached into belief, turning private faith into public discipline. Execution became more than enforcement. It became instruction. Silence played a role too. When details were withheld, rumors multiplied. Absence of clarity allowed fear to scale itself to the listener. Each person imagined the worst version, tailored to their own beliefs. In this way, uncertainty became an ally of authority, amplifying punishment without additional effort and ensuring the lesson lingered long after the act itself ended. Fear thrived best where certainty never arrived. When a king carves a warning into stone, is he describing reality or trying to create it? In ancient Egypt, authority spoke loudly in public. Decrees were etched into monuments, warnings posted at tomb entrances, proclamations recited in the king's name. These words promised protection, balance, and justice. They also promised punishment, framed not as cruelty, but as defense against chaos. This was the theatre of authority. Royal texts insist that the ruler shields the weak, feeds the hungry, and crushes disorder wherever it appears. Punishment, in this voice, is reluctant but necessary. It restores harmony. It reassures the innocent. The state does not harm, it corrects. Read this way, justice feels almost gentle. Yet propaganda is never neutral. What leaders choose to announce tells us what they fear, what they need others to believe. When a decree threatens a specific penalty, it suggests that the offense existed often enough to matter, or that obedience required constant reinforcement. Fear, like belief, fades without maintenance. Warnings carved at tombs are especially revealing. They speak directly to imagined violators, promising terrible consequences for disturbing the dead. These inscriptions do not describe events already unfolding. They attempt to prevent them. The language is performative, designed to reach across time and intimidate unseen hands. Stone becomes a mouth that never closes. The twist emerges quietly. If rulers present punishment as protection, then cruelty can hide inside virtue. The polished words on walls contrast sharply with the unpolished reality of those who experience discipline firsthand. Public certainty stands beside private suffering. The system insists it is just, even when its methods are severe. This gap between the official voice and lived experience matters. Monumental texts speak in absolutes. They leave no room for doubt, discretion, or error. But daily enforcement was messy, uneven, and deeply human. Officials interpreted orders, guards exercised judgment, bias entered quietly. None of this appears in stone. The performance of justice served a purpose beyond enforcement. It maintained faith. If people believed the system was fair, they were more likely to comply, even when outcomes felt harsh. Law became story. Punishment became narrative. Authority survived not only through force, but through persuasion, repeated until it felt natural. This does not mean the proclamations were lies. They expressed ideals the state wanted to embody, but ideals and practices rarely align perfectly. The louder the declaration, the more carefully it deserves to be read. Shouting about order can signal anxiety about its absence. Those most affected by this performance were the least visible. People without rank, wealth, or patrons moved through the system with little protection. Their stories surface only when something breaks. An accusation, a trial, a scandal recorded briefly before silence returns. Monumental texts do not speak for them. By listening to what authority emphasized and what it ignored, a pattern forms. Justice was not only applied, it was staged. The audience was the population itself, invited to trust the script while rarely seeing backstage. This tension between promise and practice shaped daily life more than any single law. Reading these monuments as messages rather than mirrors changes everything. They are less records of behavior than attempts to shape it. Each threat, each promise, each carved certainty tries to stabilize a world that leaders knew was fragile. Order had to be asserted because it could slip. Justice had to be declared because it could be doubted. In that sense, Stone inscriptions are anxious documents, revealing not confidence, but the effort required to maintain it. Fear hums beneath their polished surfaces and shapes belief over generations. Propaganda is the loud layer of power. Beneath it lies a quieter archive, where complaints, testimonies, and errors slip through. To understand how justice actually worked, the story must descend from monuments to records, from certainty to contradiction. The next section listens for those whispers, where the system faltered and revealed what it tried hardest to conceal. The state tried not to record its harshest moments, and yet here they are. Papyri preserved against intention, ink surviving where silence was preferred. These are not heroic chronicles. They are administrative leftovers, created to resolve problems, smooth over failures, or contain damage. Historians sometimes call them record accidents, moments when bureaucracy captured more truth than it meant to. Most systems document success. Ancient Egypt was no different. Official texts praise order, balance, and righteous rule. Punishment appears abstract, sanitized, often unnamed. But when something went wrong, writing became unavoidable. A theft demanded an inventory. A scandal demanded explanation. A conspiracy demanded lists. Fear forced detail. These moments are unsettling because they are practical. A stolen tool leads to interrogation notes. A missing shipment produces confession records. A suspected plot against authority generates names, relationships, timelines. None of this was meant for future readers. It was meant to close cases, assign blame, and restore calm. That is precisely why it feels so real. The camera lingers on these documents, not for spectacle, but for texture. Ink strokes pause, thicken, trail off. Someone hesitated while writing. Someone corrected a name. Someone decided what to include and what to omit. These marks are footprints left by anxiety. Administration under pressure reveals itself. One of the clearest examples comes from scandals that embarrassed institutions. When temple property went missing, or officials were accused of abuse, silence was impossible. Complaints climbed upward. Investigations followed. The resulting records show confinement, beatings, forced labor, and threats, not as ideology, but as response. Order had been disrupted. Paper was mobilized to fix it. Conspiracies leave especially sharp traces. Lists of suspects appear. Relationships are mapped. Testimonies are summarized. Punishments are hinted at, sometimes bluntly, sometimes sideways. These texts are chilling because they compress fear into form. Each line tries to reduce danger into something manageable. The human cost leaks through anyway. This is how historians triangulate truth. One papyrus alone can mislead, but when inscriptions, administrative notes, and archaeological context align, patterns snap into place. A punishment threatened in stone appears quietly executed in a record. A labor assignment mentioned briefly matches a worksite excavated centuries later. The system becomes visible through overlap, not declaration. The documentary avoids drowning in technique. What matters is the logic. States write when they must. They write most when control feels fragile. The harshest evidence survives not because cruelty was celebrated, but because it caused problems that required documentation. Violence left paperwork. There is also bias in survival. The powerful appear often because their actions mattered to administration. The powerless appear briefly, usually at moments of failure. A name surfaces, attached to an accusation, then disappears. That absence is part of the story. Silence follows punishment efficiently. Watching these records unfold feels intimate. A confession reads like a negotiation. A list feels like a net being tightened. The calm language cannot hide the stakes. Careers, bodies, futures are being decided line by line. The courtroom is not yet visible, but its shadow stretches across every page. These documents were never meant to expose a system. They were meant to contain it. Yet containment failed. Time preserved what discretion could not erase. The result is a paper trail that contradicts perfection while never openly accusing it. This is the investigative payoff. Not dramatic revelations, but accumulation. Detail after detail, routine after routine. Punishment becomes legible. Fear takes shape. Authority shows its seams. With these record accidents identified, the story is ready to step inside the courtroom itself. There, testimony, confession, and verdict converge. The language of Ma'at meets the survival instincts of ordinary people. Justice becomes performance, negotiation, and threat, all spoken softly behind a curtain labeled order. When a hearing began in ancient Egypt, it did not feel like a modern trial. There was no jury box, no raised bench of neutral judges. Instead, authority gathered in a tight ring. Officials stood or sat close, scribes prepared ink, witnesses waited under watchful eyes. The room itself felt administrative, practical, and heavy with consequence. Speech mattered because speech became record. Once words were written, they hardened. A statement scratched onto papyrus could outlive the speaker, travel upward through offices, and return later as evidence. To speak was to risk permanence. Silence, too, carried meaning and could be interpreted as guilt, defiance, or fear. Oaths threaded through this process. Invoking the gods was not ceremonial decoration. It was a binding act in a world where divine order shaped law. To lie under oath was to threaten Ma'at itself, inviting disorder into the cosmos. This belief raised the stakes of testimony. The fear was not only punishment by officials, but consequence beyond them. Yet the outcomes of these hearings were often brutally practical. The language was sacred, but the goals were material. Property needed restoring. Labor needed disciplining. Institutions needed protection. Courts existed to stabilize systems, not to explore abstract justice. Spiritual vocabulary framed decisions that were fundamentally administrative. Truth in this setting was not always a fixed point. Testimonies conflicted. Statements were withdrawn, revised, or softened. Witnesses felt pressure from multiple directions: loyalty to family, fear of authority, fear of divine punishment. The record shows negotiations unfolding quietly, line by line. What ended up written was often a compromise between what was said, what was believed, and what power required. This balance gives the courts a haunted quality. Procedure existed. There were steps, expectations, and roles. But power leaned on every stage. Officials asked questions. Scribes summarized answers. Emphasis could shift meaning. A pause might become suspicion. A contradiction might become proof. The presence of scribes changed everything. They were not passive observers. Their choices shaped memory. What they included, what they omitted, how they phrased events determined how the case would live on. Once the hearing ended, the papyrus remained. The person could vanish. The text endured. The atmosphere was tense, but rarely theatrical. No shouting crowds, no dramatic reveals. Instead, quiet intensity. The scrape of reed pens, the murmur of voices. The awareness that a single sentence could redirect a life toward labor, beating, marking, or death. Fear did not need volume. Importantly, these courts were neither purely corrupt nor purely fair. They were tools. Sometimes they restrained excess. Sometimes they enabled it. Outcomes varied by status, usefulness, and context. A skilled worker might be spared harsh penalty. A marginal figure might not. This inconsistency was not accidental. It was how power adapted. For the accused, the experience was disorienting. Divine language promised order, yet decisions could feel transactional. Justice spoke of balance while measuring cost. The gods were present as witnesses, but officials still held the pen. To speak truthfully was dangerous, to lie was dangerous. Survival lived in the space between. Time inside this process moved strangely. Hearings could stretch, pause, and resume, leaving the accused suspended between roles. Not yet condemned, no longer trusted. Waiting itself became pressure. Each delay invited speculation, each silence bred rumor. Officials were rarely rushed. The system benefited from patience. Fatigue softened resistance. Repetition blurred memory. Under such conditions, consistency mattered less than endurance. What remained constant was the sense of being watched, measured, and quietly evaluated, not only by people, but by principles said to govern the universe. Even when verdicts were mild, the experience imprinted caution. People learned how easily speech could be turned, how quickly order could narrow, and how fragile standing became once attention fixed upon you. Long after release, echoes of that scrutiny shaped behavior, posture, and silence in ordinary moments of daily life. As the section closes, attention narrows on a category of crime that unnerved Egypt's elite more than most. Violations against tombs and sacred goods did not merely steal objects. They threatened eternity, memory, and the afterlife itself. When such crimes entered the courtroom, procedure tightened, fear deepened, and the full weight of divine and state authority leaned forward at once. If eternity can be stolen, who is truly safe, living or dead? For ancient Egypt, tomb robbery struck at the deepest layer of fear. A tomb was not just a grave, it was a system. It protected the body, preserved the name, and sustained the afterlife through offerings meant to last forever. To break into one was to sabotage a future already in progress. This made tomb robbery more than theft. It was economic damage, because tombs held valuable goods, metals, linens, and ritual objects. It was also spiritual violence. Removing offerings starved the dead, damaging inscriptions threatened identity. Disturbing the body risked unraveling the careful work meant to secure eternity. Few crimes collapsed so many categories at once. Periods of instability sharpened this fear. When central authority weakened, resources thinned. Workers went unpaid. Grain shortages spread. In these moments, tomb robbery appears more frequently in records, not as rumor, but as crisis. The dead became targets because they were rich, silent, and unable to complain. The unsettling reveal lies in who sometimes appeared in these cases. It was not always desperate outsiders clawing at stone in secret. Some robberies showed signs of planning, coordination, and access. Knowledge of tomb locations, layouts, and contents suggests insider awareness. In certain scandals, guards, workmen, or local officials drifted into suspicion's orbit. The boundary between protector and violator blurred. This corrodes the comforting story of sacred order. Tombs were guarded by institutions that promised protection. When those institutions frayed, belief alone could not seal doors. Financial strain and political weakness seeped into holy ground. The sacred economy relied on trust, and trust proved vulnerable. The paper trail left behind is grim and precise. Interrogation records list names, routes, tools. Confessions describe how walls were breached, how objects were divided, how silence was bought. Recovered goods are inventoried carefully, as if order might be restored by counting what returned. Each document tries to close the wound by defining it. These records also reveal fear moving upward. Tomb robbery embarrassed officials. It suggested negligence or complicity. Investigations intensified not only to punish thieves, but to reassure the living that cosmic security still held. Writing became damage control. The dead could not testify, so paper spoke for them. Interrogations in these cases were harsh. Pressure mounted quickly. Sacred violation justified severity. Confessions often read as negotiations shaped by exhaustion and threat. Truth mattered, but so did resolution. The state needed names, explanations, and penalties it could point to. The scandal had to end. What lingers is the sense of contamination. If a tomb could be breached, then eternity itself felt unstable. Belief in the afterlife depended on physical safeguards. Once those failed, fear spread outward. If the dead were vulnerable, the living felt exposed too. This is why the response mattered so much. Punishment had to do more than correct behavior. It had to repair confidence. Examples needed to be made, messages sent, boundaries redrawn sharply. The crime attacked memory, so the reply had to restore it publicly. Tomb robbery reveals the system under stress. It exposes poverty pressing against piety, corruption eating into duty, and fear leaking through stone meant to last forever. It shows that belief alone cannot hold when material conditions collapse. As the section closes, the implication settles heavily. When sacred crimes surface, punishment becomes about more than justice. It becomes about survival of the order itself. And once the state learns to use punishment to stabilize belief, that logic does not remain confined to tombs. It expands outward, ready to be applied wherever authority feels threatened next. What happens when the accused isn't just a thief, but a threat to the throne's story of divine order? In ancient Egypt, political crimes carried a voltage unlike any other. Conspiracies, rebellions, and betrayals inside palaces did not merely challenge a ruler. They endangered the cosmic narrative that kingship itself was meant to uphold. The king was not only a political leader, he was a stabilizing force in the universe, a living anchor for Ma'at. To act against him was not simply disloyal, it was destabilizing. In that context, political justice moved differently. Faster in some ways, quieter in others. Less concerned with transparency, more concerned with containment. These cases often unfolded in shadows. Evidence became flexible, testimony could be shaped. Outcomes were sometimes determined before hearings fully began. The goal was not only to discover what happened, but to ensure that whatever had happened stopped spreading. Fear of contagion guided procedure. Here, the word crime stretches. Disagreement, ambition, or perceived disloyalty could slide into criminality when power felt threatened. The label mattered more than the act. Once attached, it justified swift removal. Punishment functioned as warning, aimed less at the accused than at everyone watching from nearby corridors. Court politics amplified this effect. Officials understood what was at stake. Careers, families, futures depended on alignment. In such an atmosphere, silence could be interpreted as consent or as suspicion. Speaking carried risk. Not speaking carried risk too. Survival depended on reading the room as much as reading the law. The records that survive from these moments are strange. Some are summaries written long after the fact, stripped of detail, presenting events as resolved inevitabilities. Others are fragmentary, broken off mid-story. Gaps appear where explanation should be. These absences feel deliberate. Forgetting can be a policy. Political cases embarrassed the system. They suggested weakness at the center. Recording too much risked preserving the very instability authority wanted erased. And yet, some writing proved unavoidable. Investigations required lists. Confessions required notes. Executions required authorization. Paper slipped through. These documents carry a different tone. Less procedural calm, more urgency beneath restraint. Names appear briefly, then vanish. Relationships are hinted at, never fully mapped. Motives are simplified. The machinery of justice feels tighter, more defensive, less patient. Punishment in these cases was rarely proportionate in a modern sense. It was exemplary. Severity sent messages outward, reinforcing boundaries inside elite spaces. The court needed reminders of where loyalty ended and annihilation began. Justice became choreography, carefully staged to preserve belief. For the accused, there was little refuge. Divine language still framed proceedings, but outcomes aligned closely with political need. Truth mattered only insofar as it supported stability. The gods were witnesses, but power decided what they saw. This creates a cold realization. Law here is not absent. It is instrumental. It exists, but bends toward preservation of authority. That bending does not require constant cruelty. It requires occasional, decisive acts that reset fear. Memory does the rest. How these cases are remembered tells its own story. Some are referenced obliquely as cautionary tales. Others disappear entirely, known only through later hints. Silence surrounds them like an intentional fog. The system succeeded when no one wanted to ask questions. Yet, the very existence of these traces suggests failure too. Control was never absolute. Anxiety leaked, writing survived, power left fingerprints. As this section closes, tension gathers. Political crimes forced Egypt's justice system into its most revealing positions. Pressure sharpened process. Fear accelerated decisions. And, in a few extraordinary cases, the mess became impossible to hide. Those moments are coming next. The following chapter steps into the most famous scandals, where conspiracies unraveled publicly and the state, despite itself, left vivid evidence behind. There, the machinery turns in full view, and the cost of maintaining divine order becomes unmistakably human. The case file reads like a confession, except the confessions do not always agree. What survives is a thick trail of papyri, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in consequence. Line after line records questions asked, answers given, goods listed, names repeated. Read together, they feel less like paperwork and more like a recording, as if voices were pressed into ink and left to wait for centuries. Officials begin with inventory. What is missing is named carefully: metals, linens, ritual objects, items meant to feed the dead forever. Each loss carries weight. Theft here is not abstract. It has location, value, and consequence. From this accounting, suspicion spreads outward. Someone must have seen something. Someone must have known. Detentions follow. Individuals are held, questioned, released, then summoned again. Statements are taken. Some are firm, others shift. A name appears once, then again, then suddenly everywhere. The repetition builds unease. The system circles its prey methodically, relying on pressure rather than speed. As the inquiry deepens, the documents expose more than a single crime. Guards admit to looking away. Administrators are mentioned as recipients of favors. Shortages surface, quietly explaining motives no one wants to highlight. The investigation widens, and with it comes an uncomfortable truth. The theft was not an anomaly. It grew inside the institution meant to prevent it. This is where the dread thickens. The bureaucracy tries to correct itself while revealing its weakness. Orders are issued, procedures tightened, more writing, more lists, more signatures. Each attempt to restore control leaves another trace of failure. The state is patching a vessel while still at sea. Punishment enters not as theory, but as sequence: detain, question, record, punish. The steps repeat with hypnotic regularity. Confinement becomes logistical. Pain becomes corrective. Making an example becomes strategy. The language remains calm, almost bored, which makes the stakes feel colder, not smaller. The confessions complicate everything. One suspect implicates another. A second contradicts the first. A third recants under pressure, then confirms parts of the story later. Truth flickers, unstable. What matters increasingly is not perfect accuracy, but closure. The system needs an ending it can stand behind. Communities whisper in the margins. The papyri do not record rumor, but rumor shapes response. Officials know who is disliked, who is expendable, who lacks protection. Decisions form in this atmosphere. Justice does not operate in isolation. It breathes the same air as fear and reputation. As punishments are decided, the priorities sharpen. Outcomes must deter future crimes. They must reassure the public. They must protect the image of authority. Whether they perfectly reflect reality becomes secondary. The goal is stability, not confession for its own sake. Reading these documents feels intimate and invasive. Names surface at their worst moments. Lives narrow to allegations and outcomes. Once the case concludes, most vanish from record entirely. Silence follows punishment efficiently, as if the system exhales and moves on. What lingers is the sense that this investigation went too far to be hidden, yet not far enough to be honest. It exposes rot while carefully containing it. The state punishes, not only to correct behavior, but to restore its own narrative. This is the unsettling heart of the case. Punishment here protects authority first, truth second. The file closes, order is declared restored, and the machinery quiets. But the inconsistencies remain on the page, waiting. When order is on the line, is the system hunting the culprit or hunting an ending? Large cases create gravity. They pull officials, witnesses, and rumors inward, compressing time and patience. Resolution becomes a need, not a preference. Names must be written. Goods must be recovered. A story must settle the air. In this pressure, blame rarely spreads evenly. The system looks for weight it can bear. Lower status individuals are easier to lift and easier to drop. They have fewer protectors, fewer written defenses, fewer voices that travel upward. Under questioning, they bend sooner. Confession shortens pain. Agreement promises survival. Truth becomes negotiable. This is where justice risks turning into performance. Officials still follow procedure. Hearings occur. Records are kept. Punishments are issued. Yet the goal shifts subtly from discovery to closure. Fear needs calming. Order needs an ending it can point to. The audience for this performance is not just the accused. It is everyone watching. Scapegoating emerges not as a plan, but as a tendency. When evidence tangles, the path of least resistance grows attractive. A marginal figure can carry a narrative more easily than a protected one. Once a confession exists, it stabilizes the case. Other inconsistencies fade. The file thickens, then closes. This does not require villains in every role. Many officials act under strain. Careers depend on resolution. Superiors demand answers. Delays invite suspicion. Within that pressure, cruelty, opportunism, and desperation coexist. One person tightens rules to protect order. Another exploits the moment. A third simply wants the process to end. The uneven weight of blame becomes visible afterward. Punished bodies appear in public view. Labor assignments, beatings, or marks announce that the system has acted. These bodies become messages. They reassure some and terrify others. Justice, in this sense, teaches through visibility. Families absorb the consequences quietly. Shame attaches itself to households. Access to work narrows. Marriage prospects dim. Children carry reputations they did not earn. The punishment spreads outward, disciplining behavior beyond the original case. Communities learn what not to do by watching who suffers. Importantly, this aftermath reinforces the performance. The visible cost convinces observers that the system works. Few ask whether the right person paid. The lesson feels clear enough. Order appears restored. Fear recedes into routine. Yet cracks remain. Whispered doubts linger. Some names are avoided. Some stories do not align. These inconsistencies rarely surface officially, but they live in memory. They teach a secondary lesson. When pressure rises, survival depends on position as much as innocence. The documentary holds this ambiguity deliberately. The system is neither purely malicious nor purely fair. It is reactive. It prioritizes stability. Under threat, it behaves like institutions often do, narrowing options until an ending feels inevitable. This logic becomes sharper at higher levels. Village scandals teach obedience locally. Palace scandals must teach loyalty to an elite audience. When the audience is the political class itself, punishment grows more strategic. Fear must travel farther, faster, and with fewer questions. That shift prepares the ground for the next turn, where conspiracy moves inward, and justice serves not just order, but the future of the throne. It also reshapes behavior among elites. Courtiers watch one another closely. Loyalty becomes performative. Silence becomes currency. People learn when to speak, when to agree, and when to disappear. Punishment does not need to fall often to be effective. It only needs to fall once, decisively, in the right place. Memory does the rest. In this environment, justice is less about right and wrong than about signaling boundaries. Those boundaries tighten quietly, almost politely, until deviation feels unthinkable. The court continues its rituals, its feasts, its prayers, but beneath them runs calculation. Everyone understands that survival depends on alignment. That understanding hums constantly, shaping ambition, friendship, and fear long before any accusation ever needs to be written down. Even hope itself learns to bend, waiting quietly for permission to exist again. A palace trial doesn't just punish a person. It rewrites who is allowed to matter. When intrigue reached the royal household, justice could no longer remain a quiet administrative tool. Elite conflict generated echoes. rumors that slipped beyond walls, records that survived by necessity, later retellings that carried unease forward in time. Power, once threatened, made noise. Plots and accusations inside palaces carried extraordinary weight. These were not disputes over grain or tools. They touched succession, loyalty, and the fragile story that bound kingship to divine order. The king was meant to embody stability. Any suggestion of fracture, any hint of alternative authority, demanded immediate attention. Justice accelerated, not toward clarity, but toward containment. Here the unsettling twist emerges. Punishment in political cases often focused less on proven actions and more on implications. What did this person represent? Whom might they rally? What knowledge did they hold? Existence itself could feel dangerous if it suggested rival lines, contested legitimacy, or unsanctioned influence. Law became preemptive. Authorities preferred outcomes that erased networks, not just individuals. Removing one figure was rarely enough. Associates vanished from records, families lost standing, names stopped appearing. The goal was to cauterize possibility. Conspiracy was treated like infection. The state acted as a living organism, sealing wounds before they spread. This reveals a sharp duality. Official language continued to insist on harmony, balance, and divine justice. Inscriptions remained serene. Rituals continued uninterrupted. Yet beneath this surface, political cases show a world shaped by suspicion. Trust narrowed, surveillance intensified, silence became protective. The system adapted defensively while proclaiming eternal calm. Evidence in these cases feels thin by design. Confessions are summarized, motives flattened, outcomes justified through necessity rather than explanation. The absence of detail is not accidental. Forgetting becomes part of the sentence. When too much is remembered, instability lingers. For those caught inside this machinery, the experience was swift and disorienting. Status did not guarantee safety. In some ways, it increased risk. Visibility attracted scrutiny. Favor shifted quickly. A whisper could become charge. Once accused, the path narrowed fast. Appeals rarely traveled far enough to matter. These punishments sent messages upward. Courtiers watched carefully. Loyalty hardened into performance. Neutrality disappeared as an option. The lesson was not subtle. Survival depended on alignment, not innocence. The court learned to police itself long before law intervened again. What makes these cases haunting is how cleanly they conclude on paper. A name disappears, order is declared restored, the official voice moves on, yet the cost radiates outward. Households collapse. Servants scatter. Dependents lose protection. Elite punishment cascades downward, touching lives far beyond the palace. And then the lens widens. Beyond famous conspiracies and royal drama lies the quiet majority. Women whose testimonies were doubted. Foreigners marked as suspicious by default. The poor whose suffering never became scandalous enough to preserve. Their punishments were intimate, domestic, and easily forgotten. These people rarely leave thick files behind. Their pain survives in fragments, if at all, yet they form the backbone of the system's lesson. While palace trials rewrote who mattered at the top, everyday justice quietly taught everyone else their place. After the loud scandals fade, the documentary turns toward them. Away from intrigue and monuments, toward kitchens, courtyards, and workyards. There, punishment did not announce itself with history's voice. It whispered, repeated, and vanished. That is where the story goes next, following justice as lived by those with fewer shields, fewer names, and far less room to be remembered at all. In a world where bread is power, survival itself can become suspicious. For most people in ancient Egypt, life unfolded close to the edge of sufficiency. Workers, servants, farmers, and the precarious poor lived inside narrow margins, where one missed ration, one failed harvest, one unpaid debt could tip daily routine into legal trouble. Punishment did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Scarcity sharpened everything. Grain was counted, labor was scheduled, absence was noticed. When institutions controlled food and employment, small acts took on heavy meaning. Taking grain from a storehouse was not hunger, it was theft. Missing work was not exhaustion, it was defiance. Speaking sharply to an overseer could be recorded as disrespect. Each label carried consequences that reached far beyond the moment. The reveal here is quiet but unsettling. Punishment often functioned less as moral correction and more as economic control. Penalties restored property, enforced labor, and disciplined movement. A fine redirected resources upward. Forced work replaced lost value. Confinement kept bodies available. Justice moved along the same channels as supply. Debt was especially dangerous. A loan taken to survive a lean season could turn into bondage if repayment failed. The language might soften the reality, but the outcome was clear. Work was assigned, freedom narrowed. The line between obligation and punishment blurred until it disappeared. The system did not need to invent new crimes. It absorbed need itself. This created a creeping presence. Authority did not loom only in courts or compounds. It lived in granaries, work rosters, and ledgers. The system was always nearby, watching flows of food and effort. People adjusted behavior accordingly, learning caution through repetition rather than decree. Community complicated everything. Neighbors could protect one another, hiding a missed ration or covering an absence. Kin networks softened blows. Silence could save someone, but community could also betray. Reporting another's failure might preserve one's own standing. Scarcity strained solidarity. Survival encouraged calculation. These choices left marks that rarely survive in writing. When records appear, they are brief. A name, an offense, an outcome. The rest remains implied. Behind each line sits a household scrambling to adjust. Children eating less, relatives negotiating quietly with officials. Punishment radiated outward, touching many who never appeared in documents. Importantly, prison was often not a destination, but a moment, a holding period, a pause in a longer chain of vulnerability. Someone might be detained, questioned, assigned labor, then released back into precarity. Freedom returned, but thinner. The risk remained, one step away from repetition. The harshest outcomes clustered where options were fewest. Those without patrons, skills, or reserves felt the system most sharply. For them, punishment was not exceptional. It was part of the landscape, as familiar as the Nile's rise and fall. The threat of correction shaped daily decisions long before any official intervened. This section resists spectacle. There is no single scandal, no dramatic villain. Instead, there is pressure. The steady squeeze of a system that treats survival as compliance. Crime becomes whatever disrupts order. Order becomes whatever protects resources. People learn to live carefully inside that equation. By centering ordinary lives, the picture changes. Justice is no longer distant or abstract. It is intimate, domestic, and repetitive. It enters kitchens and fields. It watches who eats and who works. It waits patiently for mistakes. Understanding this reframes everything that came before. Prisons, labor, beatings, and trials do not stand apart from daily life. They are extensions of it. For many, the difference between being free and being punished was not innocence, but luck, timing, and support. Economic vulnerability is only one layer of this story. Another runs just as deep, shaping who was believed, who was protected, and who was disciplined most harshly. The next section turns to gender and social status, where family life itself could become a site of control and punishment reached into the most private spaces of all. A courtroom can punish without swinging a blade. Sometimes it only needs a rumor that sticks. When women appear in Egypt's legal records, they do so in complicated ways. As property owners, witnesses, plaintiffs, accused, and neighbors pulled into disputes that begin at home and end before officials. These appearances resist simple stories, because legal capacity did not guarantee safety. Women in Egypt could own land, manage goods, inherit, and bring complaints forward. This mattered. It meant women were not invisible to the law. yet visibility carried risk. To step into legal space was to expose private life to public judgment, and that judgment was shaped by male authority, reputation, and expectation. Domestic disputes surface often, marriage contracts break down, inheritance is contested, accusations of misconduct circulate, assault appears quietly in testimony. These cases rarely stay contained. Once written down, they invite interpretation. Officials listen, scribes summarize, and social assumptions slide in between words. The tension sits here. A woman may have the right to speak, but not equal protection in being believed. Testimony is weighed not only by content, but by tone, status, and familiarity. Whose voice sounds credible, whose story aligns with expectation, whose future is easier to damage. Shame functions as punishment long before any sentence is issued. An accusation alone can isolate. Reputation thins. Marriage prospects shift. Support networks hesitate. Even if a case ends without formal penalty, its echo lingers. Justice does not need to conclude decisively to leave marks. The threat of legal action itself becomes a tool. Disputes can be escalated deliberately. A complaint can pressure behavior, extract concessions, or force silence. Law enters homes quietly, carried by fear of exposure rather than force. Control operates through anticipation. Records show women navigating this terrain carefully. Some pursue claims despite risk. Others withdraw statements. Some rely on male relatives to speak. These choices are not weakness. They are strategies shaped by uneven ground. Agency exists, but it is constrained. The tone of these cases is often subdued. There is little drama in the writing. That absence is misleading. Behind each line sits negotiation, anxiety, and calculation. Officials rarely describe emotional cost. They record outcomes. The burden falls elsewhere. Importantly, the system does not need to be overtly hostile to be dangerous. It only needs to reflect prevailing power. Male authority dominates proceedings. Female credibility is conditional. The law absorbs social bias efficiently without announcing it. This creates a quiet dread. Punishment becomes possible without conviction. A woman's body, reputation, and future can be shaped by implication alone. Justice becomes porous, allowing rumor to pass through as influence. The documentary holds this complexity without reducing women to victims or exceptions. They appear as actors making difficult choices under constraint. Their experiences reveal how control reaches inward into households and relationships, where enforcement feels personal rather than institutional. As the section closes, the lens shifts again. Beyond women navigating domestic justice lie people with even fewer protections. Foreigners, captives, and outsiders entered the system marked by difference from the start. For them, legal process could blur into ownership and punishment into routine administration. From homes, the story now moves to borders, where justice loses its familiar shape and bodies themselves become resources managed by the state. If the state can rename you, can it also rewrite what you are allowed to be? For foreigners, prisoners of war, and captives drawn into Egypt's orbit, this question was not philosophical. It was administrative. These people appear in records not as voices, but as categories. Numbers counted, bodies assigned, labor distributed. They form a shadow population, visible only through the system that managed them. Conquest and expansion fed this population steadily. Campaigns ended with captives. Borders shifted, and people moved with them. Once inside Egypt's control, outsiders entered a world of labels that determined everything that followed. Enemy, captive, worker, servant, property. Each word narrowed possibility. Each decided how closely one would be watched, how freely one could move, and how long one might remain unnamed. The reveal here is stark. For many outsiders, the difference between criminal and captive barely mattered. The outcome looked the same: controlled movement, forced labor, restricted identity. Whether punishment followed an offense or a war mattered less than the daily reality of supervision and dependency. Justice and conquest overlapped until they were hard to separate. Empires managed difference through classification. Egypt was no exception. Labels organized fear. They turned unfamiliar people into manageable units. A captive could be counted. A foreign laborer could be assigned. A group could be relocated. Individual stories dissolved into logistics. This impersonality is what chills. The records are calm. They list rations, work sites, transfers. They do not ask how it felt to lose language, kin, or name. They do not ask whether identity survived reassignment. Administration rarely does. Efficiency replaces curiosity. Yet, the system was not entirely rigid. Some outsiders became absorbed over time. Service could soften boundaries. Children born into labor groups might grow up speaking Egyptian, worshipping Egyptian gods, carrying Egyptian names. Classification could shift, slowly, unevenly. Assimilation existed, but it was conditional, granted by usefulness and compliance rather than choice. Others remained permanently marked. Their foreignness never faded. They stayed visible as different even after years of service. The label followed them, shaping marriage, work, and trust. Identity became something the state issued, not something one owned. This reframes punishment once more. Justice was not only about correcting behavior, it was about managing populations. Outsiders embodied disorder by default. Their control reassured the center that boundaries still held. Fear traveled outward through classification itself. The hypnotic quality of these records lies in what they omit. No outrage, no defense, just assignment after assignment. A person becomes a line item, then disappears. Silence follows efficiency. By tying foreigners, captives, and criminals together in practice, the system reveals its priorities. Order mattered more than origin. Productivity mattered more than story. The cosmos needed balance, and balance required bodies placed correctly. This brings the documentary's themes into alignment. Prisons without walls, labor as sentence, punishment as message. For outsiders, these were not exceptional experiences. They were the baseline. Justice arrived already decided by status. What remains is a human legacy that extends beyond Egypt. Fear as governance, classification as control, silence as success. These patterns echo into later empires, later laws, later myths about order and civilization. Egypt's justice feels distant, but its logic is familiar. As this section closes, everything circles back to absence. So much of Egypt's quiet justice is missing because it worked. It disciplined without spectacle. It erased without noise. It left few stories behind because stories were dangerous. The final chapter turns toward those echoes and absences, what later worlds inherited, what modern imagination filled in, and what Egypt's silences still do to us when we look for justice in the past and find, instead, a system that knew exactly how to disappear its own work. What if the most successful punishment Egypt invented was the one that erased its own footprints? When people imagine Egyptian justice today, they often picture extremes. Either a civilization impossibly enlightened, ruled by cosmic balance and gentle wisdom, or a cartoon of cruelty, filled with whips, chains, and theatrical terror. Both images are wrong in the same way. They are loud, and Egypt's justice, by design, was quiet. Later writers inherited fragments and filled gaps with imagination. Greek authors speculated, Roman commentators simplified, modern media leaned toward spectacle. Museums froze moments in glass, arranging artifacts as if they told complete stories. A shackle becomes proof of brutality. Its absence becomes proof of mercy. Both conclusions feel satisfying because they resolve uncertainty. Systems, however, rarely offer that comfort. The documentary returns to earlier clues. Records are patchy, not because nothing happened, but because not everything was meant to survive. The official voice speaks clearly in stone, promising order and balance. The harsher details surface only through record accidents, moments when bureaucracy was forced to write what it preferred to smooth over. Everyday control leaves fewer dramatic objects behind. A ration list does not look like punishment. A work roster does not resemble a cell, yet both can confine. This is where archaeology can mislead. Absence is tempting to interpret as innocence. If no prison complex stands, perhaps there were no prisoners. If few torture tools remain, perhaps pain was rare. But control does not always fossilize well. Schedules rot. Hunger leaves no artifact. Fear evaporates. Silence becomes evidence only if we are willing to read it that way. Modern storytelling struggles with this subtlety. Films want villains. Books want heroes. Audiences want certainty. Egypt is pushed into shapes that sell, not shapes that fit. The quiet mechanisms disappear because they are harder to dramatize. A guard watching a worksite does not photograph well. A ledger does not feel cruel until you understand what it measures. The tone here remains hushed because the past feels like a room with missing furniture. People argue loudly about what belonged there, pointing to empty spaces as proof of whatever they already believe. But emptiness can be intentional. Silence can be curated. This reframes legacy itself. Egypt's justice was not designed to shock future observers. It was designed to stabilize the present. Its success depended on blending into daily life, on making punishment feel administrative rather than violent, inevitable rather than imposed. When it worked, nothing dramatic happened. People complied. Records stayed clean. Order appeared natural. Later generations inherited that calm surface and mistook it for gentleness. Others sensed the tension underneath and overcorrected, imagining hidden horrors everywhere. Both reactions missed the system. Egypt did not need constant brutality to maintain control. It needed belief, routine, and selective severity. The quieter the enforcement, the fewer traces it left behind. Museums display what survives, not what mattered most. Textbooks summarize what was written, not what was lived. The result is distortion born from imbalance. We see the monuments, not the granaries. The laws, not the hunger. The punishments that failed quietly enough to leave no mark. This section does not accuse the past of deception. It observes design. Silence is not neutral. It can be engineered. Systems that last learn how to disappear their own violence, preserving legitimacy while discarding memory. Egypt was exceptionally good at this. Understanding that changes how we listen. Instead of asking where the prisons were, we ask how confinement operated. Instead of counting executions, we examine fear. Instead of searching for cruelty, we trace control. The picture that emerges is less dramatic, more unsettling. As this section closes, the ground is prepared for the final reveal. Myths have been confronted, not shattered, but softened enough to see through. The next step returns to evidence itself, weighing fragments carefully, asking what can be claimed without distortion. Silence lingers here as warning, not absence, reminding us that power does not always announce itself, and that what goes missing may be the most deliberate thing of all. Its success is measured not by what we see, but by how rarely we question the quiet, orderly past handed to us as truth without asking who paid. History doesn't only hide the past, it hides the people the past wanted you to forget. With that thought, the documentary slows into its closing argument, not to persuade by force, but to explain how knowledge itself is assembled from fragments that were never meant to agree. Historians begin with questions before conclusions. Who wrote this text? For whom? Under what pressure? A decree carved in stone speaks differently than a complaint written in ink. One proclaims certainty. The other leaks anxiety. Neither is neutral. Each carries intention like a watermark. Sources are weighed against one another, not trusted in isolation. A papyrus describes a punishment. An inscription threatens one. An excavation reveals a worksite where bodies labored for decades. Alone, each can mislead. Together, they begin to outline a system. Agreement strengthens claims. Contradiction reveals bias. Silence demands caution. What matters just as much is what never appears. Most people did not write. Most suffering did not announce itself. Everyday control leaves few artifacts. Hunger does not fossilize. Fear does not leave a tool behind. When archaeology finds nothing, it does not mean nothing happened. It means the system worked quietly enough to leave no trace. This is the final puzzle piece. Egypt's justice appears calm not because it was gentle, but because it was designed to look orderly. The system preserved what served legitimacy: balance, piety, authority, continuity. These were written, carved, repeated. The ugliest details were allowed to fade, except when bureaucracy accidentally trapped them on papyrus during moments of failure or scandal. This does not mean Egyptians were cynical about order. They valued it sincerely. Ma'at was not propaganda alone. It was a worldview, a hope that the universe could be kept from collapsing into chaos. That belief shaped law, punishment, and daily life. And here lies the discomfort. Sincere devotion to order can still justify severe control. Holding these truths together is difficult. It is easier to choose a side, to imagine Egypt as humane and enlightened, or brutal and oppressive. But history resists purity. Systems built on belief can produce care and cruelty at once. The same structure that feeds people can discipline them harshly when resources thin. The same rituals that promise protection can enforce obedience. Scholars therefore speak carefully. They avoid claiming more than evidence allows. They note variation across time and place. They acknowledge gaps. This restraint is not weakness. It is respect for complexity. Overclaiming simplifies the past into comfort. The lullaby tone here is intentional. There is no final verdict, no moral delivered with force. Instead, there is weight. Ambiguity settles in. The audience is invited to sit with it, to feel how systems can be orderly and violent simultaneously without contradiction. This approach honors the people hidden by silence, not by pretending to recover every voice, but by refusing to erase them a second time through oversimplification. Absence becomes meaningful. Gaps become warnings. As the section closes, attention turns inward. What does this history do to us now? How easily do we accept quiet systems as just? How often do we confuse order with fairness? Egypt becomes a mirror rather than a lesson. With the evidence weighed, the story prepares its final turn. The last section does not look further back. It looks here, asking how ancient habits persist, and why humans continue to call power order, even when it costs more than we are willing to name. It asks what we choose not to see in our own time, which records we trust, and which silences we excuse as normal. The past is not finished speaking. It waits patiently for attention, knowing that recognition is rare and that forgetting is easier. What endures, finally, is not certainty, but responsibility. To listen carefully, to doubt tidy stories, and to remember that calm surfaces often conceal the most disciplined forms of force. That habit has never truly disappeared. It persists. The cruelest part isn't what they did, it's how calmly they called it balance. This ending does not arrive with thunder. It closes like a door that clicks softly, sealing something behind you. The story returns to faces glimpsed earlier, the accused whose name became a label, not a memory. The system never needed to shout to change his future. It only needed to write. Once, temples rise again in the mind, serene stone masking busy rooms where keys were counted. Holiness and control shared corridors without argument. The desert returns, wide and empty, turning distance into a wall no hand had to build. A horizon can confine as efficiently as iron. Worksites hum, watched, rationed, timed. Punishment moves with the body, not the building. Always. It travels, it settles, it stays, quietly, patiently, complete, enough. The king's voice echoes from stone, promising protection, balance, eternal order. The words never mention bruises, hunger, or fear. They never list the names that disappeared. Official certainty floats above lived experience like incense, pleasant and blinding. Beneath it, records whisper instead of proclaiming. A ration missed, a hearing delayed, a body reassigned. These fragments do not argue, they wait, they remember, relentlessly. Time listens, paper survives, people fade, power remains, balanced. This is the philosophical turn, unsettling precisely because it feels familiar. Egypt's punishments feel distant until the pattern becomes visible. Systems prefer clean stories about why they hurt people. Order is easier to accept than coercion. Balance sounds kinder than control. When suffering is framed as necessity, outrage softens. When authority sounds calm, violence feels procedural. No one has to feel cruel. The system does that work itself, efficiently. The documentary never forces modern parallels into view. It lets them form slowly, like shapes emerging in low light. Nothing is named, nothing is accused directly, yet recognition stirs. Viewers feel the echo in their own assumptions. How often does calm language hide harm? How often does routine excuse damage? These questions arise without instruction. They linger. They follow the listener beyond the screen, uninvited, persistent, unanswered, necessary, still. What remains is an aftertaste rather than a conclusion. A sense of lives bent quietly by rules that claim to heal the world. Justice aimed to restore balance. It often restored authority first. That distinction mattered to those inside the system. Most never left testimony. They survive only as numbers, labels, absences. The past does not shout their pain. It breathes it faintly, enough to be felt, on purpose, by design. The closing image returns to where the story began. Records whisper. They always have. Silence was never emptiness. It was selection. Administration decided what deserved to last. What remained shaped memory. What vanished shaped obedience. The system succeeded not by spectacle, but by discretion. Future generations inherited calm surfaces. They mistook them for peace. The trick held, it still does, often, especially when we stop asking who paid, who vanished, why, quietly. The documentary's final question is not historical trivia. It is ethical and immediate. Not were they brutal, but how did they make brutality look like order? That framing lingers. It resists closure. It demands attention rather than judgment. Listeners are invited to carry it forward, into conversations, into silences, into moments where authority feels natural. The past leans close here, not to accuse, to remind. Patterns repeat, when unnoticed, when unnamed, always. The puzzle completes itself without announcing victory. Every chapter's clue clicks into place. Prisons without walls, labor as sentence, punishment as message, silence as success. Together, they form a system that shaped memory deliberately. The calm ending mirrors the calm violence it describes. Nothing erupts, nothing resolves cleanly. The listener is left awake, not shocked. Curious, uneasy, alert. That state is the point. It asks for responsibility. Now, the silence that outlived them becomes final evidence, not of innocence, of effectiveness. The system shaped what the future would remember and what it would forget. This is not condemnation. It is recognition. Justice can be orderly and still wound deeply. Balance can excuse harm. Calm can discipline more efficiently than terror. The past closes its door gently. It does not trap the listener. It releases them with a question, carried forward.